Hi, welcome. Before we begin, feel free to leave a mark in the comments, a city name, a time zone, or whatever place this found you in. This one's about laws, the kind that banned shoes, or sleeves, or eating at the wrong time of day. Some rules made sense, most didn't, and a few were quietly ignored for centuries. Entire villages once had to adjust their lives to satisfy a rule no one could explain. If that sounds like your kind of historical background noise, you can subscribe. Comments are welcome, mostly just to see who's still awake. Now dim whatever lights are left and get comfortable. We'll start with the simple things, like how not to wear buttons. Before rules were written, they were repeated. Not by officials, not by priests, but by people watching each other and adjusting. Most customs didn't begin with decisions. They began with habits, an object placed a certain way, a gesture paused, then copied, a word avoided, then forgotten. Across towns and centuries there were things people no longer questioned, because someone before them hadn't questioned either. No explanations, no records, just the rhythm of everyday agreement. That's where this begins, not with laws, but with the things people stopped doing without knowing why. In many parts of Europe, sound was treated with caution. It wasn't just volume that mattered, it was timing, context, and intent. Certain noises were avoided not out of fear but out of habit. Whistling, for instance, was discouraged in several towns on a specific day of the week, usually Thursday. There are no surviving laws to explain why, but the practice was widespread enough to leave traces. Families taught their children not to do it. Market stalls kept quiet. One town in northern Germany is said to have posted wooden signs with a simple warning, "No whistling today." The explanation varied. Some believed it was a day of preparation, others treated it as a superstition, passed down without comment. In a few regions, older men carried walking sticks for the purpose of interrupting the sound, not violently, just rhythmically, a tap against a cobbled step, a polite correction. Over time, the rule faded, but in some oral histories, Thursday still held its reputation. Inside churches, silence carried different weight. During the early modern period, several parishes in France and Saxony imposed restrictions on laughter during sermons. This wasn't a cultural preference, it was managed behaviour. Those who interrupted services, even unintentionally, could be fined or removed. Parish records mention adults laughing at translation errors, children giggling at funeral hymns. In most cases, they were escorted out by clerks or watched closely the following week. Certain churches added wooden notices above the entrance, written in the vernacular, not Latin. The message was clear: keep still, be quiet. In some communities, the worst offenders were publicly named or made to sit at the front, not in punishment, but visibility. The expectation wasn't reverence, it was containment. Monastic orders had their own systems. Among the Benedictines, speech was restricted, not only during prayer, but also in courtyards, workshops, and dormitories. In Cistercian communities, gestures replaced conversation. A raised finger meant permission. A cupped hand meant hunger. Even writing was limited to formal duties. One record from the late 1300s describes a monk who began to fume while weaving sandals. He was denied butter for several days, a quiet reprimand. Meals were taken in silence, mistakes were absorbed. Rooms echoed only when someone coughed. These were not harsh environments, but they were highly regulated, and sound, when it came, had purpose. In parts of rural Scandinavia, music itself carried risk. Certain tunes were believed to cause illness. Some were associated with storms. A few had names that implied danger. One was translated loosely as the waking chord. Another was known only as the left melody. If someone played it in a tavern, the response wasn't confrontation. The barkeeper would lower the lanterns. Patrons would stop mid-sentence, and the musician would find something else to play. No record of these melodies survives. Only the warnings remain. Elsewhere, bells were treated with even more suspicion. In several English villages, it was discouraged to ring them after sunset, not out of respect, but precaution. Bells signalled fire, or death, or war. To hear them at night, without cause, unsettled the street. There's one account from the 1700s in which a small chapel bell rang just as dusk fell. No one was missing, nothing was wrong. Still, the townspeople gathered in silence outside the church and stayed there until morning. No reason was given, none was asked for. It was simply what they did. Silence wasn't the only form of control. Appearance mattered too. Throughout much of medieval and early modern Europe, clothing was regulated not just by fashion or climate, but by law. These weren't style guides, they were restrictions, known as sumptuary laws. They dictated who could wear what, by rank, by gender, by income, and sometimes by reputation. In many places, even the fabric itself was tied to social order. Certain dyes were reserved for nobility. Velvet was limited to specific titles. Fur was restricted by tax bracket. These rules weren't always enforced by courts. They were more often maintained by observation, by neighbours, by guilds, by gossip. A tailor who ignored them might lose business. A merchant who dressed above his rank might be denied access to a market stall. Enforcement came slowly, but it arrived. In 14th century Florence, a law was passed limiting the length of women's trains, not for safety or modesty, but for hierarchy. The longer the fabric that dragged behind you, the more wealth you appeared to have. Tailors who exceeded the limit could be fined. In some cases, the garments were confiscated and restitched in public. In Venice, red shoes were reserved for senators. The dye was expensive, and the colour was known on sight. In England, gold and silver thread could only be worn by those with income above a set threshold. This didn't stop people from trying. Some purchased counterfeit thread, others trimmed their sleeves in hidden places, inside cuffs, under collars, just enough to feel it was worn. People who broke these laws weren't jailed, they were fined or embarrassed. In some cases, they were made examples of. In France, a merchant's daughter was once marched through the street, wearing a plain shift after being caught in borrowed court robes. The robe was returned. The reputation was not. Clothing served as identification, and when someone wore the wrong marker, the response was less about fashion and more about order. Sumptuary enforcement also reached into mourning. In parts of Spain and southern France, widows were required to wear reversed gowns, turned inside out, with seams exposed. The effect was not symbolic, it was visual. A public sign of social transition. Some were expected to wear veils for an entire year. Others were instructed to wear unlined wool, even in summer. It wasn't just grief, it was regulation. Tailors kept black cloth in bulk. Records show sudden orders after plagues or fires, and in wealthier towns, mourning inspectors were assigned by the parish. Their job was to verify that appropriate dress was maintained. Not all complied, but few resisted openly. There were, of course, quiet acts of resistance. Some women in Paris were fined for wearing sleeves that resembled royal cuffs. A butcher's daughter in Prague was reprimanded for wearing velvet trim. These weren't acts of rebellion. They were miscalculations. Most people didn't know where the line was until they crossed it. And even then it depended who noticed. What someone wore was not simply a matter of taste. It was a display, monitored, measured, and occasionally punished. In rural areas, the restrictions shifted, but did not disappear. Certain villages forbade unmarried women from wearing blue. Others linked jewelry to fertility, or its absence. In some parts of Bohemia, a woman who wore coral without children was thought to bring drought. In Iceland, widows were discouraged from wearing colour for the rest of their lives. Enforcement was inconsistent, but memory was not. What someone wore could be forgotten in weeks, or remembered for decades. Clothing travelled farther than people, and the image lasted longer than the explanation. Let's turn now to the things people avoided handling. Across many households in the medieval and early modern world, certain objects were treated with care that went beyond function. A bowl was not simply a vessel. A chair was not always for sitting. These were domestic limits, unwritten, unspoken, and quietly enforced. In some homes, a specific item might remain in place for generations. It wasn't valuable. It wasn't rare. It was simply known to be left alone. Mirrors carried particular attention. In Northern Europe, small personal mirrors were sometimes covered after dusk, not to protect them, but to avoid drawing attention. In towns along the Rhine, it was common for families to drape cloth over polished glass during thunderstorms. Travellers' accounts from the Low Countries mention mirrors hidden in drawers at night. A custom appears in household manuals, usually without explanation. Embroidered covers were made for the task, often dark blue or faded green. These were not decorative. They were functional, placed each evening without discussion, then folded away after sunrise. Basins used for washing also had their boundaries. In households where servants were employed, each person often had a designated bowl. Visitors might be offered one set aside only for guests. In parts of Brittany, it was believed that water left in a bowl overnight could attract illness. Households would tip the basin onto the hearthstone before sleep, allowing it to dry completely. Some families avoided using bowls that had belonged to the recently deceased. A widow's basin, especially, might be retired altogether, placed in a loft, turned upside down, or taken out of the home entirely. No one was told to do this, but many did. Chairs were treated with equal care. In some homes, a chair near the hearth was always left empty, not for use, but for memory. The custom was strongest in rural districts, where traditions held longer. Stories circulated of illness following those who sat in the wrong place. In village parishes in Wales and northern England, clergy wrote of parishioners who kept a single chair untouched after the death of a relative. No inscription, no mention in the will, just an understanding among those who lived there. The chair was not cursed. It was remembered, and sitting in it too soon felt like a kind of interruption. Objects associated with childbirth were handled differently. In many parts of Europe, a wooden stool used during labour was kept apart from other furniture. It might be stored in the loft or in a locked cupboard. Some midwives brought their own, wrapped in cloth, and refused to let others touch it. There are references to these stools in ecclesiastical court records where disputes arose over ownership. In one case from Rowan, a family refused to return a birthing stool, claiming it had never been properly returned. The dispute lasted weeks, not because of value, but because the stool had been used. Even utensils had rules. Spoons were sometimes marked with a notch or symbol to designate use. A sick room might have a single spoon used only for broth. Some towns recorded fines for servants who allowed tableware to be borrowed between households, not for hygiene, for order. When these items disappeared, it was rarely reported, but their presence and their place was maintained with care. A home was not defined by its walls. It was shaped by the objects people left alone. In another part of daily life, rules appeared at the table. Meals were not simply about food. They were occasions with structure, pace, and expectation. Who sat where? Who served whom? Which foods were shared? Which gestures were accepted? Across regions and centuries, people followed table customs that few would now recognize. Many of these rules had nothing to do with nutrition. They were signals of status, of humility, of belief. In parts of early medieval Europe, bread was more than a staple. It was a surface. At many meals, food was served directly on thick slabs of bread, known as trenchers. These weren't meant to be eaten by the guest. At the end of the meal, the used bread was either collected and fed to dogs, or given to the poor. In wealthier homes, the trenchers were sometimes handed to servants, who were expected to dispose of them without comment. The idea of eating what touched the main dish was avoided. It wasn't about thrift, it was about distance, from the mess, from the poor, from the meal that had ended. Salt held its own logic. A shared bowl of salt was placed on the table, not for flavour, but for structure. To sit above the salt meant proximity to the head of the household. Those below it were considered lesser guests. Some households kept the salt in elaborate containers. Others marked the boundary with simple wooden bowls. There were customs around touching it. In parts of Flanders, it was rude to reach for salt without being offered. In central France, spilling it required an apology, and occasionally a prayer. The salt was not just seasoning, it marked position. Cups were shared differently. In taverns and farmhouses, it was common to drink from a communal vessel. In some regions, broth was served in one large bowl, passed around without spoons. People drank in turn, wiping the rim with their sleeve. This was not viewed as unhygienic. It was customary. In England, a passing cup known as the loving cup was used at feasts. Two people held it together, while a third stood watch to prevent interruption. The practice was not ceremonial. It was practical. In crowded halls, it helped maintain order, and it showed trust. Someone always had to look away. In certain homes, meat was handled cautiously. Not every guest was allowed to cut it. In noble houses, the task was performed by someone trained in carving, using specific angles and gestures. Manuals exist, written in Latin and vernacular, describing the correct way to slice a capon or divide a roast. It was not only a matter of presentation, it showed control. At some banquets, the carver would remain standing for hours, speaking only when addressed. His presence was part of the setting, not the conversation. He was visible, but not included. In some coastal regions, even the food itself was regulated. Shellfish, especially lobster, carried conflicting meanings. In early New England, it was so common that servants once petitioned not to be fed it more than 3 times a week. But elsewhere, lobster was treated as a delicacy and subject to restriction. In parts of France and Spain, sumptuary codes linked certain foods to status. Lobster, with its rich colour and seasonal scarcity, was reserved for feast days or noble tables. Eating it outside those boundaries could lead to fines, not always enforced but remembered. There are records of towns where lower-class families were scolded for cooking lobster on ordinary days. The issue wasn't the food, it was the gesture, a sign of reaching beyond one's place, with claws. Finally, there were foods that carried meaning beyond appetite. In convents, some meals were taken in silence, with only a single verse read aloud between courses. In mourning households, spoons were turned upside down when not in use. In German-speaking villages, it was considered unlucky to leave the table before bread was finished. Some families would bury uneaten crusts in the garden, believing they kept away illness. Others left them on windowsills overnight, for no clear reason at all. The practice wasn't recorded in formal histories. It passed through kitchens, from mother to daughter. In some homes, crusts were burned. In others, buried beside herbs. There were no clear reasons, only the belief that crumbs left loose might bring illness, or memory, or return. Rules around food did not always involve eating. Many focused on what remained, the crumbs, the peel, the rind. What to do with the final spoonful? Who was allowed to take it? These decisions were made quietly, but consistently. The table was where structure became visible, and where people followed it, one gesture at a time. In many communities, disposal was not a neutral act. Certain items were not thrown away. They were burned, quietly, deliberately, sometimes in view of others, sometimes in private. This wasn't a matter of waste. It was something else, a way of closing a process or distancing a memory. Burning did not mean destruction in the modern sense. It meant removal. An object had served its purpose, and keeping it was considered dangerous, or simply unnecessary. Clothing associated with death was often treated this way. In parts of rural England and northern France, garments worn by the deceased were burned rather than inherited. This was especially true of shoes. A superstition held that walking in a dead person's shoes invited misfortune. Some households waited 3 days, then lit the fire at dusk, usually in a field or hearth. The act was quiet, often no words were said. The smell of leather and wool was noted in several diary entries, sharp, acrid, but familiar. People recognized it, and then went back inside. In childbirth, the practice extended to tools. After a difficult delivery, the cloth used to wrap the newborn was sometimes burned by the midwife. The bowl used to wash the mother might be scoured with ash, then placed into the fire, not immediately, sometimes days later. These items weren't cursed, but they weren't kept. The idea was not to save objects from memory, but to prevent memory from becoming too strong. In a few regions of Hungary and Saxony, entire bundles of linen were set aside after birth. They were not reused. They were not passed down. When the weather allowed, they were quietly burned behind the home. Letters, too, were often burned. In households where literacy was limited, writing carries significance. A letter from a distant son, a page from a sermon, a note sent during illness. These were not discarded casually, but once their purpose had passed, they were placed into fire, folded first, touched once more, then dropped in. Some families had a small bowl used only for burning paper. It was passed down, though rarely mentioned. The fire was part of the record, an end to something that no longer needed to exist on the shelf. Objects linked to illness were also treated this way. In Sweden and Finland, blankets used during a long sickness were sometimes burned on the night of recovery. The practice was not universal, but where it occurred, it followed a quiet pattern. The room was cleaned, the hearth was cleared, the fabric was placed directly onto the embers. The person who had been ill was expected not to watch. It wasn't a punishment. It was a way of moving forward, one blanket lighter. In some cases, even tools were burned. A shepherd's crook broken during a storm. A wooden spoon used to serve the last meal of a dying parent. These items were not cursed or feared. They were simply considered finished. A fire was a kind of punctuation. The object was acknowledged, and then it was gone. Burning was not ceremony. It was practice. An ordinary ending, done in quiet, repeated across seasons and households without much remark. Yet behind each instance was a choice to keep nothing that no longer belonged. Not all customs were about action. Some were about stillness. Entire days, or parts of them, were quietly marked as times to stay inside. It wasn't always about weather or danger. In many regions, staying indoors was a form of participation. People observed certain dates, not with rituals, but with absence. They stayed off the roads, closed shutters, blew out lamps earlier than usual. The message wasn't printed or spoken aloud. It was understood. In parts of the Low Countries, wind was treated with suspicion. A strong draught passing through the home was believed to bring illness. Even in warm seasons, windows were left closed if the wind changed direction. Children were told not to stand near doorways. In Flanders, some households placed small stones against the bottom of the door frame to block movement. The fear was not of cold, but of something carried on air. Market days were sometimes cancelled if gusts were too sharp. Church bells rang faster than usual, not to summon but to signal caution. It meant something was wrong with the air. No one said this aloud, but doors closed and shutters stayed that way until the sound stopped. In northern Italy, a more specific fear took hold. Certain festivals were followed by a period known informally as the Quiet Week. It had no religious backing, but was widely followed. During this time, families stayed home after sunset. Musicians avoided public squares. Young men were discouraged from travelling between villages. It was believed that too much celebration attracted attention, not all of it good. A joyful wedding, for example, might be followed by a week of low voices and early meals. So a celebration was often followed by restraint. Laughter gave way to lowered voices. Candles burned shorter. It wasn't grief, it was balance, joy, followed by stillness. Elsewhere, silence was connected to mourning. In parts of Bavaria and Bohemia, the death of a neighbour required households to dim their fires for several evenings. People ate cold meals. Curtains were drawn, children were told to play indoors. The effect was communal, there was no enforcement. But those who ignored the practice were remembered. In some towns, it extended to business. Bakers reduced their hours. Inns served only broth and beer. No music was played, no games were hosted. Grief moved from house to house in quiet habits. The air felt different for a few nights. People walked more slowly. Even dogs were kept inside. There was no list of rules, only shared behaviour. In the Scottish Highlands, certain dates were believed to carry bad luck for travel. One of these fell in late January just after the solstice celebrations. Travellers avoided crossing rivers. Tradesmen paused work on hope. One shepherd's journal from 1711 describes staying inside for 3 days until the wind stopped circling the hills. The calendar did not mark this period, but those who lived there knew it. The fields were empty. Doors stayed latched. The days passed without notice, and then it returned, whatever rhythm had been paused. No announcement, no decision, just doors opening again, as if nothing had happened. In households across Poland and Lithuania, days of ancestral visitation were observed by staying home. No candles were lit, no guests were welcomed. Meals were taken without salt. The idea was not fear, but respect. Spirits were believed to walk through the village, checking the places they once lived. To be outside was seen as intrusive. People moved slowly, or not at all. Some slept in their clothes to avoid waking a resting spirit. By morning the air was said to carry them, not as ghosts, but as presence. People avoided speaking, even in sleep, to avoid drawing attention. By morning the house felt normal again, but for some, the quiet lingered a little longer. Staying indoors was not always a reaction to threat. Sometimes it was a shared gesture of withdrawal, a pause, a moment without footsteps in the street, without horses, without noise. These pauses weren't announced. They were observed, and then forgotten, until the next one arrived. In daily life, entry was not always simple. Stepping into a room involved more than just a threshold. In many places, people followed small, habitual gestures to mark their arrival. Some knocked 3 times, some paused at the lintel, others touched the door frame or spoke a few words under their breath. These were not formal greetings, they were precautions, quiet, unacknowledged, and shaped by place. In parts of rural Wales, it was common to touch the top of the door frame when entering someone else's home, not out of politeness, but caution. It was said to ward off spirits, or simply to show that nothing was being carried physically or otherwise. Some added a phrase, always in Welsh, spoken just loud enough to be heard by the threshold. Guests who failed to do this weren't scolded, but they weren't trusted either. In households where the custom was strong, doors were often left ajar, but entry was never assumed. People waited a moment. If no one came, they stepped through slowly, not as guests, but as watchers of the room they had just joined. In northern Germany, shoes were often removed not at the door but just inside, on the 3rd step. First 2 were considered neutral. The 3rd marked the boundary. In some towns, children were taught to step in, turn clockwise, and greet the space before greeting the people. It was not theatrical, it was habit. In homes with wood floors, a small rug was placed at the pivot point. Guests who turned too early or too late were silently corrected. The practice faded over time, but traces of it appear in oral histories and household notes. A small rug by a threshold, a story about stepping wrong, enough to suggest the gesture once mattered. In Icelandic farms, visitors waited until spoken to before entering the main room. Even with the door open, it was understood that the house itself had rhythm, and entering without acknowledgement disrupted it. Sometimes the pause lasted a minute, sometimes longer. Those already inside did not rush to respond. They finished their sentence, or stirred the pot. Only then was the visitor invited to step forward. The pause was not hostile, it was procedural, and it ensured the space stayed intact. In parts of southern France, doorways carried inherited meanings. A stone placed near the entry marked whether visitors were welcome. If the stone was upright, the house was open. If laid on its side, it meant do not enter, not because of anger, but because the day wasn't right. Visitors who ignored the sign were rarely confronted. but their name might be left out of future invitations. In some villages, this system lasted into the 19th century. Other customs were based on posture. In some Polish homes, men were expected to bow slightly when passing through a doorway for the first time that day. Women, in contrast, would touch the sleeve or elbow of the person nearest to them, a signal of neutrality, not affection. These gestures were not universal, but they repeated often enough to shape memory. Children copied them without question, and visitors adjusted quickly. In all these cases, the doorway was more than a frame. It was a filter. People crossed it carefully, without announcement, but not without awareness. To enter was to agree, silently, to whatever rules lived inside. Some rules were spoken, others were understood. In many communities, conversation had boundaries, not just in volume, but in content. Certain topics were avoided in specific settings. Some words were only used outdoors, others were whispered, even when no one else was near. These weren't taboos in the formal sense. They were silences built over time, soft exclusions that shaped what could be said and when. In parts of the Scottish Highlands, it was considered unlucky to speak directly about the sea before a journey. Fishermen used substitutions instead. They might call it the wide place or the road without end. Even those who didn't believe in the superstition followed it. Children were corrected mid-sentence. Elders changed the subject. The logic behind it was rarely explained. It was simply known that naming the sea too early could call its attention, and not always in a welcome way. In many Welsh communities, death was referred to indirectly. A person who had passed was said to have gone to the other field, or stepped through. These phrases softened the moment, but they also served a structural role. They allowed conversations to continue without pause. Grief remained present, but contained. In certain parishes, it was even discouraged to say the name of the dead during mealtime, not out of disrespect, but to avoid drawing memory too close to the table. People developed ways of referring without speaking. A tilt of the head, a hand placed flat on the table. These weren't code, just habits, learned by watching others, and passed on without explanation. Illness had its own verbal precautions. In German-speaking households, the word for fever was often replaced with a gesture, a slight wave of the hand near the brow. In rural Bohemia, coughing was never mentioned aloud in church. Some carried small cloths or herbs to suppress it, not for health, but for decorum. To speak of symptoms too early was seen as an invitation. Families waited until evening to discuss what they had seen or felt. The logic was slow and not always clear, but it repeated across households, towns, and generations. It became a rhythm of speech, delayed, softened, redirected, not out of fear, but out of caution, as if naming something made it harder to contain. In parts of Italy, pregnancy was left unspoken for as long as possible. Neighbours noticed but said nothing. Family members exchanged looks, or gave small gifts of food, but no direct reference was made until a formal acknowledgement, usually from the household matriarch. This could be delayed by weeks or months. There was no penalty for speaking early, but doing so marked someone as thoughtless, or worse, careless. Even among close relatives, the condition was treated as something in progress, and therefore incomplete. Words might bring attention, and attention might bring harm, so families wait until it showed, or until it couldn't be ignored. Certain phrases were avoided for reasons no one could trace. In some villages in Austria, the word for mirror was swapped for the glass. In others, the word for left was skipped entirely during candle rituals. Sailors used entire dialects at sea that differed from their speech at home. These weren't encoded for secrecy. They evolved from hesitation, from repetition, from people hearing what shouldn't be said and learning not to repeat it. What wasn't said carried weight, and over time, it shaped more than conversation. It defined presence, memory, respect. Most of all, it defined what kind of quiet was acceptable and what kind was expected. Not all participation was voluntary. In many parts of the pre-modern world, people were expected to witness. Certain events required the presence of others, not for celebration, but for confirmation. A death, a punishment, a confession, a contract. These moments were shaped not only by what occurred, but by who stood nearby. To look away was sometimes an option. Other times, it was considered a failure. The role of the watcher was quiet, but it carried weight. In parts of 17th century England, public punishments were scheduled in the mid-morning, after market hours. This wasn't done for convenience. It was done to guarantee an audience. Local residents were expected to gather. Children were often present. In smaller towns, school was paused for the day. Those who didn't attend weren't fined, but their absence was noted. Watching was part of the process, not just to see justice, but to carry its memory back into daily life. The event lasted minutes. The effect lasted years. People remembered who had watched and who had not. Even a silent witness became part of the story. In the Low Countries, deathbed gatherings were common. When someone was near the end, neighbours were informed. Relatives were summoned, even from nearby farms. They didn't offer help. They watched. In many cases, they stood by the wall while a priest administered last rite. They didn't speak unless asked. It was considered improper to leave the room before the final breath. Afterward, some households served a warm drink, not in celebration, but to mark that the role of witness had ended. Diaries from the time described the silence afterward. Not grief, exactly, but a stillness. A pause between the moment witnessed and the return to normal life. Legal oaths often relied on witnesses as well. In parts of Italy and southern Salents, land agreements were sometimes settled not in writing but in the presence of three unrelated men. The ritual involved handshakes, spoken pledges, and the touching of soil. All three witnesses had to nod. Some were compensated with bread. Others were not. In some regions, the witnesses were expected to recite the terms weeks later to confirm accuracy. The act of remembering became a legal tool. Forgetting, in these cases, wasn't neutral. It meant the oath could be questioned. A memory lost too soon could threaten a contract. So remembering became its own responsibility. In villages across Bohemia, confessions were sometimes made in the presence of the entire household. This was not part of religious practice. It was social. A man who had caused offence might be expected to speak aloud after dinner, with family members seated at the table. He would apologise, not to one person, but to everyone listening. No one interrupted. No one replied. The confession wasn't accepted. It was observed. After a moment of silence, someone would clear the plates, and life would resume. The walls would accept it. The confession wasn't erased, but it was finished. Watching wasn't always active. It could be passive, almost reluctant. But once someone had seen something, a punishment, a mistake, a final breath. That knowledge stayed with them. It didn't need to be written or shared. It was carried forward in glances, in gestures, in the way people responded to names years later. The requirement wasn't to act, it was to know, and once known, it couldn't be undone. In most households, there were things that stayed behind, not because they were treasured, but because they were too ordinary to carry. A chair that no one sat in anymore, a cracked plate with one matching bowl, a child's shoe, years outgrown. These weren't heirlooms, they were remnants, and in many places it was considered normal, even necessary, to leave something behind when moving on. A gesture of quiet separation, a way to keep the next stage from touching the last. In rural Ireland, it was common to leave a coin hidden beneath the hearthstone when a family moved out. The coin wasn't retrieved. It was meant for the house, not as payment, but as recognition that a life had passed through, that something had been finished. Some families used buttons instead. Others, a small wooden token marked with a knife. When new tenants moved in, the object was usually found and discarded, but the act of leaving it, that was the important part. It meant the family had closed the chapter, not with ceremony, but with an object. Something left behind so that life could continue elsewhere, undisturbed. In parts of Poland and Western Russia, blankets that had been used during illness were folded and left in the attic, not thrown away, not repurposed, simply set aside. They remained there for years. No one touched them. Even when storage was limited, the bundle wasn't disturbed. Occasionally, a new blanket was added to the same corner. The pile grew slowly, like a private archive, not of memories, but of moments people didn't want returned. Some customs were architectural. In certain German villages, a new house wasn't considered complete until something was sealed into the walls. A piece of linen, a written prayer, a lock of hair. These items weren't meant to be seen again. Their presence was symbolic, a human trace built into the structure itself. Builders sometimes left behind their tools, not by accident. A small trowel, a bent chisel. It was a way of marking work without inscription. The object remained, but its purpose was finished. Even among the wealthy, certain things were left on purpose. In France, mourning households occasionally left one curtain closed when the rest were opened. It remained that way until the family line ended or the house was sold. In Italy, some families refused to repaint a single patch of wall, usually near a stair or doorway, because a child had once marked it with soot. These weren't sentimental gestures. They were quiet limits, boundaries of time rather than space. To leave something behind wasn't to honour it, it was to let it settle. Most of these gestures were unspoken. No explanation was offered. A thing was placed, or folded, or sealed, and it stayed there. People moved on. The object did not. It became part of the room, or the attic, or the soil beneath the foundation. A reminder that not everything travelled forward, and not everything was meant to.